like to introduce to the stage Jeremy Davis from Moody's. This is a star panel here. We've got several speakers going to cover a wide range of issues on the integration of credit ratings. And Jeremy Davis is Assistant Vice President, Corporate Social Responsibility at Moody's, and responsible for driving the integration of Moody's corporate CSR strategy into the business, and also primary responsibility for communications, including the annual CSR report and other related CSR and ESG reporting and ranking indices. Jerry?
Thank you. At Moody's, we seek to open the door to a better future for people around the world. We believe that knowledge fuels opportunity and access is everything. And the core of our business is to provide credit ratings, research, tools, and analysis that help equip participants in global financial markets to understand the risks and move forward with critical insight. Our CSR and ESG efforts are rooted in that same approach, and it's with that lens that we'd like to present this panel today, and I'd like to invite and join me in welcoming to the stage our moderator, Chris Fowle, who's head of Americas for PRI, and who helps manage signatory relations in the region. I'm sure many of you in the audience know Chris well, and if you don't, you should. And then our panelists from Moody's Investor Service. So we have Swami Venkataraman, who's an SVP in our dedicated ESG team. Gail Sussman, the head of our U.S. Public Finance team. Gabriel Torres from our Sovereign Risk Group. And Bruce Clark from our Corporate Finance Group, who focuses on transportation and capital goods. So thank you, and please welcome me and join them to the stage.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to CECP for producing another terrific event. As said, my name is Chris Fowle. I'm the head of the Americas for the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, and I do know many of you in the room. For those I don't, very quickly, PRI is an international nonprofit headquartered in London that works with investors that make commitments to integrate ESG into their investment processes, and I think we serve as a good answer to the question that was posed on the panel with Mark, Erica, and Morgan earlier around how can investors better demonstrate their commitment to ESG. We have more than 2,100 signatories around the world now, representing over 80 trillion in assets. And some of those now are corporates that are thinking about their investable retirement funds, whether defined benefit or defined corporation contribution plans, and Bloomberg, as well as Unilever, both of whom were mentioned earlier, are both PRI signatories with regard to their defined contribution plans. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about an initiative that PRI has related to a statement on ESG in credit ratings that we put out a couple of years ago, the goal of which was to enhance the systematic and transparent considerations of ESG factors in credit risk analysis. We recognize that there's a need for discussion among credit practitioners to deepen our understanding of materiality of ESG factors on credit risk, to create a common language, to avoid and clarify issues around double counting of relevant ESG issues, and really importantly, to enhance transparency. And so we put out this statement that our investor signatories can sign on to. 137 representing over 27 trillion in assets have done so. And in addition, 17 credit rating agencies have signed up to this initiative. They're listed here on the slide and include, of course, Moody's, who we're featuring on today's panel, also S&P, who, in terms of progress on ESG, we would say are leading the pack, strong efforts in this regard. Fitch Ratings has been a new joiner, and you'll see listed other rating agencies from around the world, including specialist, smaller CRAs and regional CRAs from, for example, China. In terms of what we've been doing, like I said, we started a couple of years ago with the statement. We created an advisory committee, which is a typical way that we work. We bring together our signatories to focus on a particular issue. We put out a report called Shifting Perceptions, Part 1, the state of play, where were credit rating agencies with regard to integration and transparency related to ESG. Then we ran a series of investor forums around the world. We've had 15 over the course of a year, and all of the cities listed on this map. And then we put out a second report called Shifting Perceptions, Part 2, exploring the disconnects with regard to credit rating agencies, incorporation of ESG, the findings really from all of those global workshops. And then our next step is going to be putting out a new report in the fourth quarter, which is going to be a focus on solutions. And so please do keep an eye out for that. Our program head for this effort is based in London, Carmen Nuzzo, who is terrific. And if you'd like more information, I'd be happy to make an introduction to Carmen for yourselves. So that's enough for me. Let's move on to the main event. And I'm going to start off with Swami. You know, ESG considerations are becoming increasingly relevant to market participants, as we've been discussing today. But why and what exactly are they in the context of credit rating or credit risk analysis? And Swami, how is Moody's approaching ESG factors, both in credit ratings as well as in its broader strategy?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a question we face all the time. You know, do you incorporate ESG into credit ratings? If so, how? Right? It's a common. So what I thought I would do is I'd start with two examples and to illustrate the approach, and then maybe give you a more theoretical approach as to our thoughts about how we approach this whole issue. So about 10 days ago, Moody's downgraded all three big utilities in California, and the reason we downgraded them was. There's been a lot of wildfires in the state, and we sort of have now a poorer perception of the ability of these utilities to recover costs that they incurred on account of these wildfires. Now, these costs, they're not going to crystallize for many years, maybe even a decade. But our perception and our assessment of those risks was bad enough that we were able to incorporate them today into ratings. And the context there is these wildfires are getting worse, at least partly because of climate change. They're getting more frequent and they're getting more worse, at least partly because of climate change. And we said that explicitly in our press release, that it is partly driven by climate change considerations. Similarly, a little earlier this summer, we upgraded a global power generating company. And again, not solely, but partly because they completely refocused their strategy away from fossil-based power generation to renewable power generation. They made a big investment, they acquired a company, and they reoriented their strategy. And we thought that that contributed enough in the needle to upgrade the company, partly at least, in terms of our perception. So these two, I quote these two examples because these two are examples where there is not an immediate financial change. But yet there is enough there for us to incorporate. So the general answer to do we incorporate ESG is yes. We've always include everything that's relevant to a credit rating, irrespective of how far down the road the issue might seem. Everything relevant to a credit rating is always in the rating. What happens is usually you're able to make that assessment with adequate degree of, not usually, sometimes you're able to make that decision or the judgment with a degree of confidence that you need to actually change a rating. And sometimes you don't have that degree of confidence. That really is where the distinction is. If you go to our ratings in Europe, for a decade now, those ratings have been trending down. They are 3 notches lower now than they were 10 years ago on average. And a lot of it is driven by renewable energy, climate policies, M&A transactions, but those transactions were in turn caused by climate change policies and management positioning themselves strategically to navigate this whole environment. So we always incorporate them. The difference is in certain times, there's not an ability to change ratings today in response to some events that may be far down the road. For example, if you're talking about where the demand for oil and gas is going to be in 2040 or 2045, and Bruce can talk more about it when he talks about autos, clearly as the auto sector changes, there is a possibility. But oftentimes, you cannot change a rating today for 2 main reasons. One, what that scenario is extremely uncertain. You don't know what that scenario is going to be. Second, companies have a lot of time to reposition their business focus, to change their approach so that there may not be that credit impact that you see today. They are able to avoid that as well. So primarily, these are the 2 reasons why and it's common to all ESG risks. I quoted climate change because it's a popular example. But any ESG risk that's very long-term in nature, you will face a similar sort of issue. So the strategy we've adopted is twofold. The first, I would broadly call it a transparency strategy, which is where ratings are changing today, obviously there's no issue there. Where ratings are not changing today, but there is a possibility that things might change down the road. We want to be more transparent in how we address it. So increasingly in every credit opinion, we're starting to include a section on whether it's climate change or whether it's any other ESG issue, governance or social or anything. We're trying to write more and more and more. So increasingly you will see that. You will see a statement on what sort of risk can affect this company's ratings down the road, even if they don't do so today. The other approach we are taking is, can we, and my colleagues will talk more about the work they're doing on these issues, can we, even if we do not change the rating today, can we provide some other assessment of what sort of E or S or G issue this company faces? And how significant is that risk, at least relative to all the other companies? Can you rank order companies on specific risk issues on ESG? Now, this second part is really where we are in a work in progress mode. We have not launched assessments formally. We have not done. We have said publicly, as I'm doing now, that this is part of our approach as to how we would like to do things. We would like to give investors tools to assess those risks, even if they may not be affecting a rating today. So at least investors are better informed that this is today's ratings, but here are certain ESG risks that could affect this company, and this is an assessment of how that risk can affect this particular company. That's sort of how we want to go down the road over time. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, the strategy that we adopt. Some ratings are already affected. In other ratings, you'll see more and more transparency in our written work, credit opinions, and then hopefully more analytic assessments of specific ESG issues down the road.
Great. That's terrific, Swami. Thanks very much. And why don't we hear from the analysts now? And I'd like each of them, for their specific sectors, to talk about ESG factors and how they affect creditworthiness in their sectors. Let's start with Gail.
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for having us. I guess where I really want to start is to kind of emphasize Swami's point. When I sit back and look at the environmental, the social, the governance issues, and I was preparing a couple of little tidbits for today, or what kind of stories I could think of to really drive this home, it was really clear to me that we have always been incorporating these risks into our credit view, but now we're being more transparent in calling them out and saying this is an environmental risk, this is a social risk. So let me just give you a couple of examples. I have maybe 2 examples from each to really crystallize it for you. And as Chris said, I'm responsible for our U.S. Public finance business. So we cover governments, states, higher education, healthcare, and I have examples from all. So let me give you 2 social examples just to think about. One is, I was reading yesterday an article about population growth in Australia. I know that's not the United States, but it's the same concept, right? So population growth straining existing infrastructure in cities. And what the article was really talking about was that the growth in the major cities is beginning to increase demand for education, healthcare, and transportation services. So in order to be able to react to that, those regional local governments need to invest in infrastructure, and then they have to think about, well, where do they get the money to invest in that infrastructure? So either they find new revenues to be able to pay for it, or potentially they have to think about those trade-offs in terms of, well, what do I have to skimp on over here in order to be able to cover an investment that I hadn't necessarily planned for? So the whole concept of population growth being a social issue, it's not a problem, it's a thing. And what happens when that thing changes? Another social concept is the growing costs of healthcare. And the growth of healthcare on governments as well as individual people and businesses. The reason the growth of healthcare has an impact on states and local governments is really rooted in the fact that the population is aging, and as healthcare costs grow, it takes a bigger chunk out of the revenue for any particular state government. So some of you may know the largest expenditure that a state has related to these kinds of things is Medicaid. And then they also have their post-employment health benefits that they pay to their retirees. So yesterday I read that the US spends close to 2 times the amount of other high-income countries as a share of the economy on healthcare. That's a huge number, as opposed to around 8 to 12% in other high-income in other high-income countries. So when you think about it, why does this matter? This all sort of links back to it. It ultimately ends up affecting the finances. And finances are a consistent element of all of our different methodologies, not just on the government side, but on the corporate side as well. And once it starts to hit the bottom line, it begins to affect credit. Let me just mention two quick things on the environmental side, some of which you may know, some of which you may not. So Moody's recently upgraded the general obligation rating for the state of Florida. You may know that the state of Florida is highly exposed to storm, hurricane, and other kinds of climate risk. And the biggest issue was not that they didn't have good governance or good financials, it's that the state stood behind two state-sponsored hurricane funds. So no matter how much revenue they had, no matter how much resource they collected, they still had this huge exposure to these catastrophe funds. Over time, they built their reserves even greater, and they also significantly reduced their exposure to the hurricane funds. And over time, we began to see those risks, those climate risks, mitigated. And then in the last few months, we upgraded the rating to AAA. So it was the climate risk that actually held back the state of Florida from being AAA, which otherwise it would have been. And then how they managed those risks and mitigated them increased our view of their financial flexibility. And then I'll just give one example on the governance side, and then I'm going to pass it over to Gabriel. When we think about governance, again, affecting credit, the best example, the easiest example I could think of was what happened at Penn State a number of years ago. So when the sexual assault allegations came to light, and the more you began to peel the onion, you could see that there was a growing amount of risk that was attributed to the impact of those particular situations on the university. University was very highly rated, tremendous endowment, tremendous support from alumni, but nonetheless, the risks all came back to finance. They developed a reputational risk. They had governance issues, questions. People weren't sure with the way that their governance process was working. Even though they may have had the litigation cost covered and the risk of the financial impact of litigation, nonetheless, if you weren't comfortable that they've solved for this problem again, then you have a reputational risk here. And the reputational risk impacts people's decisions to go, which affects enrollment, which again affects the bottom line. So it all kind of comes back, at least in the public finance sector, back to different ways you can get to finances, whether it's governance, social issues, or the environment, but it all ultimately affects the bottom line. That's really the reason that when we look at these risks, we think they've always been incorporated in these ratings.
Thanks, Gail. Now to Gabriel on sovereigns.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Gabriel Torres, I'm part of Moody Sovereign Group. A lot of what I'm going to be saying echoes what my colleagues have said. This is a common story. One of them is, of course, transparency, being clear about. And we, in the Sovereign Group, published a report only a couple of months ago on how we incorporate ESG risk, ESG considerations into the sovereign analysis. And as we went through it, one of the things that became clear is we've been doing it for a while, in some cases explicitly, and others not so much. And this was simply a way of making it clear. It wasn't so much new, but it was, I think, being more specific about this. Likewise to what's been happening in other lines of business at Moody's. We in the Sovereign Group now, in our reports, are explicitly mentioning those countries that have certain exposure. Tends to be more on the social side, but it can be, on the environmental side, but it can happen in others as well. And so how we incorporate that. The ESG, the incorporation of ESG into sovereign, the report we published, is not meant to be a methodology. It's really an explanation. And it's not meant to come up with scores for ESG. We're not saying that certain countries are better at the environment than others, or that certain countries are better at managing their social demands. The closest that we might have, because it's part of our methodology, is a scoring of governance. We do incorporate directly an assessment of governance in our assessment of credit risk for countries. But within the broad concept of governance, we really kind of focus on a narrow subset, has to do with debt payment. So governance is much more than that for many countries. And so we do have scores. For any country that we follow, we have a 15-point scale, and we will rank those countries in governance, and that's based on a series of numbers. We don't do that so much for ESG. So one of the things for ENS, one of the things that we realized when we were looking at this is ES and G are kind of lumped together, and we hear a lot of them as if they were all one or parts of the same concept. And really, they're pretty different. They're very distinct. In our methodology, E and S, environmental and social, tend to appear or show up indirectly. And I'm going to give a few examples to explain all of this. Whereas, as I mentioned before, governance is not. Governance is a direct measure of what we do. And we rely on assessments by third parties, by our own measures, by looking at things. For example, right now we use inflation as an indication of governance in terms of its ability, a country to meet and maintain policy promises, if you will. So we look at this variety of indicators. In some cases, like I said, it's very direct. In others, for E and S, for environmental and social, it's not. So what are the examples? Where has environmental shown up? Well, clear example, small islands. Caribbean, for example, last year, St. Martin hit in the hurricane season, saw losses that have been estimated over 200% of GDP. Was, in their case, bailed out to a great extent by the Dutch government. For small islands across the world and small countries across the world, environmental concerns are a direct risk. But it's not only small countries. Argentina, for example, this year has many problems. But one issue that has precipitated the problems they have today is a huge drought that they've had at the beginning of the year. They are a major agricultural exporter. And so, of course, as a consequence of the drought, they exported less. As a consequence of exporting less, they had less dollars, and that affected the currency. So these things kind of, follow, a cycle or a series of consequences. You start something, and then it can get worse and worse. Another example of this was in 2007, 2008, partly because of environmental risk, but others. Food prices rose across the world. As food prices rose, inflation increased. Inflation in the poorer countries has a greater percentage of food in the CPI than in advanced economies. So inflation in poorer countries rose faster than it did, just as a consequence of the higher food prices. This led to riots in some countries, and it actually led to a rating action on our part on Egypt. So it starts with an environmental concern. It leads to lack of sufficient food, higher prices. Now you have a crisis. Social, some examples of social. I view social and governance sort of counterpart. Social, if you will, is the demand side. Governance is the supply side. Social really refers to what are societies demanding? What do they need? What do they want? And we look at governance, what is their ability to respond and provide an answer to those demands? Well, Arab Spring, clearly an example of social problems. In their case, that had been there for decades, and yet one day it exploded. But they don't all have to be so dramatic. Chile, for example, over the last decade or so, has seen its debt rise. There's several reasons for that. One reason is society is demanding more. The country became richer. As the country became richer, society wanted more. One of the things they wanted more was they realized is their higher education system was not set up for a greater percentage of high school graduates to get into college. So they were going to very expensive schools, in some cases much as expensive as the United States, in a country that has income that's a fraction of the United States, leading to an increase in student loans and a society that protested and said, no, this is enough of it. And so the government had to pay for some of that. And as a result, you had an increase in debt. So again, you see this chain of causation starting with certain demands and leading to eventually an impact on the rating, which we downgraded not that long ago. And then finally, governance. Governance permeates a lot of what we do, a lot of what we look at. Many examples here. I'll just mention one big one. 2004, Argentina defaults. It defaults not because it lacks the money. In fact, it had the money to make its debt payments. It defaults because it decides it would not accept certain rulings that were against it in New York courts. This is a governance issue, part of rule of law. As a consequence, the money was stopped, entered into default. So the payments were there waiting for investors. And so if you were looking at Argentina purely from the perspective prior to this of their ability to pay, and you did a cash flow analysis, you would have not predicted a problem. It was the governance that brought it down. So kind of running out of time, we want to give my colleagues some time, but just some thoughts on how.
Thanks, Gabriel. That's good. That's great. Let's turn it over to Bruce.
Okay, Bruce Clark. I'm the analyst for the domestic auto companies at Moody's, and also follow some of the capital goods companies like Cat and Deere. Just want to hit a. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I not on?
I don't know.
Doesn't sound like it. Yeah.
It's on. Testing. Good.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Sound man. All right. A couple of important points I want to emphasize. Number one, as you listen to all of our comments, it's important to realize or remember that everything that we do is geared towards one thing, and that is assessing the likelihood that a company is going to be able to service its debt and the likelihood of default and the severity of default if, in fact, they don't do it. Everything that we look at in all of our analysis is geared towards getting to an answer to that question. In the auto sector, ES&G has always played an important part of what we've done, but I, as an analyst, never really thought of it as ES&G. I just thought of it as fundamental analysis. Quick example, Ford, the F-150, far and away the most important vehicle that Ford makes. It makes or breaks that company. When they moved to an all-aluminum body, that was purely an ES&G type issue. They did that to save on fuel economy, and they did that because of the regulations in the United States and California. I, as an analyst, didn't really look at it from that perspective. I said, are you going to be able to make this vehicle, make it effectively? Are you going to be able to repair it when it gets into an accident? Will customers buy it? But it incorporated a very important ESG concept, and it was very important in terms of assessing Ford's ability to service its debt. It's always been there. Another example would be, for instance, on the governance side, General Motors. One of the big problems they had, one of the major credit risks, was being a target of activist investors. Ford did not have that problem, in part because of the heavy family ownership. That's a very important fundamental analytic issue, but it does relate to this whole topic of ES&G. So the concept is that it's always been there, and some of the things that Swami has talked about with respect to transparency, it's going to help our communication with the market in terms of understanding what we look at with the ES&G. But frankly, it's also going to help make me a better analyst, because as Moody's comes up with these very rigorous tools internally that help us communicate better with the external market, it frankly helps me be a better analyst also, because it brings a lot of discipline in terms of making sure that we look at a whole host of issues relating to ESG, and that analysts in different parts of the organization can have tools that bring a greater degree of consistency. Liquidity has always been important at Moody's. We now have tools that bring a lot of consistency in terms of how every single analyst at Moody's looks at it. That's reflected in our speculative grade liquidity analysis and also our liquidity risk assessments. So just echoing the points that have been made earlier, number one, we've always looked at issues related to ES&G. We may not have called them that, but we will increasingly do that because it helps communicate better with the market, number one. And number two, as Gail was mentioning, almost everything that we do and all of our assessments come back to what's fundamental for all credit analysis, and that is generating cash, being able to service your debt. And that's kind of the lens through which we looked at the F-150. That's kind of the lens through which we looked at the governance issues at Ford and GM. That's also the same kind of lens that we use when we look at things like battery electric vehicles. What impact does it have on cash flow? What impact does it have on fundamental credit quality? And we're simply going to become much more rigorous and transparent in communicating those issues that have always underpinned the ratings.
Thanks, Bruce. And I mean, just to follow up with you a little bit, one of the consistent messages here is that it's about the materiality, about the effect on cash flows. And with regard to governance, I know you said to me earlier that every taxi driver knows about the VW scandal. Right? Yes. From your perspective, from a G perspective, how does that play out? How does that fit into your assessment of creditworthiness?
I think specifically of Volkswagen.
Correct. Yeah.
Clearly, one of the more important issues that we looked at. We spent a lot of time assessing And again, I'm not the analyst on Volkswagen, so I'm 1 degree of separation removed from it. But sitting down and assessing in committee with literally about 13 people, all of whom have probably 10 years of experience or more with credit quality, assessing the degree of either skepticism or credibility to which that we should ascribe to what Volkswagen is communicating with us. And what happened with that scandal was a very important issue from the standpoint of looking at the company's credibility. Now, we did it within the context for this group of ES&G. That's what we do with virtually every credit that we rate. I mean, if you can be in a rating committee and you will have people who've been around Moody's for a long time who will remember what companies have told us about their financial strategy, their operating strategy, and it gets very much to the heart of credibility. And we were looking at that an awful lot with Volkswagen. What was their credibility? How much trust could we place in their statements about what they were going to be doing with electrification and so forth? So it was a very, very important issue in that rating committee.
Thank you, thank you. I want to open it up to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. I don't know, Swami, do you want to say something?
Can I get one last word before?
Yeah, of course.
And I don't know how many of you sort of grasped the point that Chris made before and Bruce also just sort of reiterated throughout. The importance of financial materiality. I mean, ES&G issues have a lot of different issues in them. And oftentimes, various ESG people who are interested in ESG issues are interested that companies should do X or Y, even though, because that X or Y could have an impact on how it influences society around them, even though it may not have a financial impact on the company, right? And that is a valid objective. A lot of ESG data and analysis providers look at those things. Yeah, are companies influencing the society around them by doing certain things? But some of those may not have any financial impact on the company. So when we look at ESG issues, our focus will be on financial materiality to the credit quality of the company. So you will find our approach to ESG to be different in that respect from many other ESG sort of data and research providers. I just wanted to highlight that point because our concern is going to remain very solidly focused on financial materiality, which may not be the sole concern for many other people.
Questions? We'll start here.
Thank you. So with the equity side, it seems that a lot of the new data that's out now is finally robust enough to be able to use it across, comparing different companies. I would think your jobs are a little bit easier now because you have a richer data set. I don't mean easy, it's not an easy job, but how do you decide which of the data points are material on the financial side so a movement on the equity side was that it was, you used to have to rely on the company to give you the data. Now there's a bunch of young people that are just surfing the web and finding this information about the company and aggregating it to give us more data points. Is it similar on your side now where you have a richer set of data that you can use for your analysis? And is it helpful through your lens?
So we are part of also another body. Our chief credit officer is part of what's called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which has come out with very detailed recommendations on what and how companies should be disclosing, for example, on climate change. And so we are a big votary of better enhanced disclosure by companies because we still believe that what companies disclose today in their 10Ks or the 10Qs does not go far enough to assess many of these risks. Our approach is, we want to be fundamental analysts, as we've been always saying throughout. So we may buy data from other people, but our approach to buying data is not just buying ESG data from other people. I think the ESG part of it, we want to do it ourselves, decide what's material. We may seek to get data on the fundamental operations of a company that sometimes may be available for purchase, but may not be available in an SEC filing so easily, that sort of thing. But I think the work on identifying ESG relevant factors will be ours internally. And we decide what we think is important to credit.
Other questions? Jill?
Thank you. Jill Baker with Terra Alpha Investments. Just a point of clarification. What I'm hearing sounds like there's still a large degree of subjectivity in your analytical work. And my question is, from the perspective of the E in ESG, which is what Terra Alpha is concerned with, we feel that there's a lot of specific science-based data available, like NASA and NOAA and the CIMP5 data that's able to make projections about climate that countries use to plan. And basically, I'm thinking of companies like Mercer and Guy Carpenter coming out with different internal projections for climate scenarios that they use to then guide their reinsurance clients and things like that. Do you guys have any internal models that deal with climate projections? You gave some very good one-off anecdotal observations, and you're very astute analysts, but if you had a NASA projection that showed certain things about certain geographies, would that be helpful? And is that something, that data is free, by the way, but is that something that you guys are rolling out internally?
Right. So one of the challenges with climate scenarios is that if we Moody's, if we use a climate scenario. So what we generally try to say is when we do our climate change analysis, for example, we want to look at, let's say, a 2-degree long-term scenario. So that we have said publicly for a lot of sectors. One of the things we did was we wrote a report on identifying all sectors that have environmental risks. 85 sectors, $68 trillion of debt. This was 2015, the year the Paris Agreement was signed. Since then, about a dozen of those sectors are specifically climate change, environmental exposure, high-risk sectors. We've spent the last year in particular writing a detailed report on each of those sectors, talking about how climate change affects ratings in those sectors, or could affect ratings in those sectors. So laying out a carbon framework, if you will, for each of those sectors. Now, we're taking the next step now and trying to go. So first we look at all the sectors, then we look at the highly exposed sectors. Now we want to go down and look at every company within the highly exposed sectors. That's the work that we're doing. But when we take up a climate scenario, one of the most important things for us, and we've said in these reports that we want to look at 2-degree scenarios. Now, what does a 2-degree scenario look like? The most important thing is if we have a 2-degree scenario that says how much flooding there will be to affect a coastal city, we need to have that scenario provide something very consistent on what does a 2-degree scenario do for the demand on oil and gas, because we're also rating oil and gas companies. And then what does that 2-degree scenario do in terms of how much carbon can be put into the atmosphere, which in turn will limit caps on so many other different sectors. So one of the most important requirements of any scenario analysis, there's plenty of those scenario analysis put out. Columbia University puts out a lot of those things as well. Is that just a weather prediction is not enough. It needs to go down and drill into how much coal, how much steel, how much cement, how much, because that's what eventually goes into each of these ratings, and they all have to be consistent. We can't use one scenario, a beautifully designed scenario, to do our public finance ratings, because it gives us great information on how much flooding is likely to happen, if that same data source cannot provide us all these other things as well, because you have to be consistent across Moody's. So what we're trying to do is standardize on the International Energy Agency's scenarios. They put out a fairly detailed study that goes across different sectors, different types of commodities. It may not be the scenario that actually turns out to be, but at least it's something that's consistent. It's a lot of people accept it globally. It's called the World Energy Outlook. They also, and so we sort of, that's likely the scenario that we will standardize on, because it gives us an ability to evaluate all sectors on a consistent basis, more or less.